Welcome everybody. I am Johanna Ulloa Giron and I work for the Poudre Public Library District. I am the supervisor for the Community Services Department. I am really excited to see you all here today. I think right now we have 127 people with us. So thank you so much for taking time to having these really important conversations with us. We are having the second episode of the series, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Why Allyship in Action. And we are really happy to have you here. I'm gonna explain a little bit again how the format is gonna work today. So we are going to have the chat, and you can see the chat button at the bottom of your screen. So if you have a comment that you wish the panelists to see, please send us a comment. If you have a question that is directly for Heather, the presenter, please insert that question in the question and answer button, again, on the bottom of your screen. We expect that we can have a great time together, that we can have uncomfortable conversations here at the library with the BIPOC Alliance, partnering with the BIPOC Alliance in a respectful way. As it happens with all the programs that we host also in our fiscal rooms, if anybody is being disrespectful or displaying behaviors that are not conducive to having a good environment to have these uncomfortable conversations, we will ask you to leave, and then we will actually proceed to get you out of the room. So please remain respectful. Again, welcome. And now I want to introduce you to Andrew Nades, one of the co-founders for the BIPOC Alliance. Again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Johanna, and thank you all for being here. My name is Andrew Nades, and I am one of the co-founders of the BIPOC Alliance. The Alliance is a newly formed group of people of color that seeks to collaborate across different sectors to advance issues that affect BIPOC communities in Larimer County. We will be developing and aligning our work in collaboration with other groups, focusing broadly on policing, education, legislation, positions of power, mental health, and liberatory practices. If you wish to become involved, please fill out the engagement form. A link will be placed in the chat. And if you want more information on upcoming programs, events, or services, please follow us on Facebook or Instagram at BIPOC Alliance for each of those. Our mission statement is collectively, Black, Indigenous, and people of color of Larimer County are taking action to decolonize systems and institutions, redefine our relationship to the movement, and liberate ourselves and our people. This series seeks to explore how you can contribute to this mission by examining racism, discrimination, and whiteness. And leading this exploration is our series presenter, Professor Heather Arnold-Renicker.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I appreciate that introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. And welcome back to those of you who are rejoining us from last week. We're happy to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and start showing you all the PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared. So last week we talked about the fact that we were going to try to make these a little bit more interactive for you all, and realize that because you have a webinar link, we are unable to do that. It would change the link, so you wouldn't actually have access to the same link. So if you decide that you're going to join us for the subsequent sessions, the next two that we have available, we are going to email out a new link that would allow you to be in a Zoom meeting as opposed to a webinar, which would allow us to do a little bit more interactivity. So today is going to be similar to last week and a bit more of me talking at you a little bit. And then we will kind of move on from there as best we can. I just want to do a brief introduction. I know that many of you were with us last week and heard some of this, but I know that there might be some new folks today. So my name is Heather Arnold-Renicker. I use pronouns she and her. I'm a clinical assistant faculty member at the University of Denver. My area of focus is in macro social work. So I do a lot of work around politics and organizing and policy, and then leadership management and administration. I teach classes on anti-oppression, and then I do consulting with organizations around anti-oppression work and anti-racism specifically. I'm also a co-founder of the chapter of Showing Up for Racial Justice in Denver. I founded the Surge chapter with some other fellow activists back in 2014, and have been doing racial justice organizing ever since, sort of in many spaces, and now work with the national Surge team. So I'm excited to be with you all today. I did want to talk just a little bit briefly about the chat. So I know Johanna mentioned this in the beginning. So just a reminder for folks who maybe have joined us since the introduction. If you have a comment or something you'd like to share in terms of a resource or something, feel free to use the chat. If you have a question, please try to use the Q&A, just because it helps us keep a track of the questions that are being asked. So the comment section will be the chat box, and then the Q&A section will be the questions. There will be this is recorded, so it will be available to you or to anyone that you want to share it with post session. And then I will do my best to answer the questions, but also folks who are monitoring the chat and the Q&A will also help me with that. I again want to just do a land acknowledgement. So I currently reside on the lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, and Ute tribes, and Fort Collins also has the Arapaho lands in addition to Cheyenne, Sioux, and Ute. The land acknowledgement is really to honor the history and present of the genocide and forced removal of Indigenous people, and to encourage us to think about how we can reflect on our continued relationship to these practices and our desire to support racial health and environmental justice initiatives that center Indigenous people, and then how we might commit to returning land to Indigenous people. So want to, again, acknowledge that. We did this last week as well, but it's important to continue to keep that at the forefront of our minds. Just revisit really quickly the community agreements we pulled up last week. And due to the feedback that some of you offered, which I really appreciated, we added homophobia and ageism, which weren't in the original agreements, from Mackenzie Mack, who posted these on their website as a consultant. So just to reiterate for folks who are newer, and just in case you don't remember from last week, we just agreed to struggle against homophobia, ageism, racism, sizeism, transphobia, sexism, ableism, and the ways we internalize misinformation about our own identities and the identities of other people. We know that no space can be completely safe, and we agree to work together towards harm reduction, so centering those most affected by injustice in our conversations, even if that means decentering ourselves. So that really just means that a lot of times in spaces like this, we ask for safety, but safety looks really different for everyone, and sometimes that is about not wanting to be uncomfortable, especially when we're talking about issues around whiteness and racism and the role of white people in that. So really want to just emphasize that there's a difference between being unsafe and being uncomfortable, and that many of these conversations will probably feel uncomfortable, but we, we agree to work together to do this harm reduction piece where no one will be sort of in danger. We agree to sit with the discomfort that comes with having these conversations. We agree to try our best not to shame ourselves. We'll talk a lot about shame today because we're focused on white fragility today. And there's a big element of shame within white fragility. We agree to value the viewpoints of other people that don't challenge or conflict with our right to exist. And obviously a couple of these will come in really handy when we're engaging a bit more together in breakouts. We agree that it's okay to have feelings. We'll talk about this today too, because in white fragility, I think there's a lot of conversation about how white folks try to show up with our feelings and what it actually means and looks like. So we'll talk a little more about that. And I see a question about what sessions 3 and 4 will focus on. I'm trying to build a little bit on what comes up for you all in the chat and some of the questions. So we focused on white fragility today due to some of the comments and questions that came up last week. I'll kind of see what happens this week, but my goal and sort of aim is to focus on white supremacy culture next week, which is sort of digging into the nuances of what white culture actually looks like and means, and how that can show up in different spaces. And then what are the ways we can sort of interrupt that and combat that. The last session is probably going to be a little bit more around allyship and accomplice behavior. So looking towards that action piece as we wrap up the series. Thank you for that question. I'm going to start today with just a quote from Audre Lorde, who was a civil rights activist and writer, self-described Black lesbian mother warrior poet. And the quote is, "I have no platitudes for you. Every day of your life is practice in becoming the person you want to be. No instantaneous miracle is suddenly going to occur and make you brave and courageous and true." And I think this quote really spoke to me around the responsibility that I have every day to be brave and courageous and show up in the ways that I do around anti-oppression and anti-racism, and that no one is sort of going to wait for me or make me feel better about that. I have to make that decision on my own. And so it's a daily decision to show up and have difficult conversations around these things in my life. And so welcome you into that space, and really appreciate you being here and taking that either first step to do that, or maybe it's your 1000th step. Either way, I welcome you to our conversation. So we're going to start by revisiting the homework. So for folks who are new, hopefully you were able to access the PowerPoint from last week, and it had a podcast that we were encouraging folks to listen to in between now and then. And then an article on White Beloved's Black Lives Matter is not a trend, it's an invitation to our own freedom too. I also asked everyone to just think about what you want your action to be and what your next steps are. How can you incorporate more of these things into your conversations and actions and changes into your own lives? So for folks who are returning, if you would like to, you can use the chat to comment on just reflections you have on the podcast, questions that came up for you. And I will do my best to kind of follow what you're commenting on. And also, around the article, if there was anything that, as you were reviewing it, kind of came up for you. So feel free to use the chat to post some reflections on that or questions that came up for you. You can also use the Q&A. And then for folks who weren't able to get to this, I can talk a little bit more about what these were as folks are potentially posting some of their thoughts in the chat. So the On Being podcast is a discussion between Resma Menakem and Robin DiAngelo about racism and whiteness. Resma talks a lot about the embodiment of trauma around race and racism, and Robin DiAngelo is speaking from sort of a white fragility and whiteness perspective. And they're just kind of engaging in a conversation about what it means for white people to engage in anti-racism work. The reading really is talking more about how do we consider racial justice a part of our own struggle as white people? What do we see as our own commitment and dedication to it, and as well as what it is that we gain from doing anti-racism work and disrupting white supremacy. So the White Beloveds article is actually, it's not a publication, it's someone's blog post. So the folks can put it into the chat. I think Carrie put it in the chat for you if you couldn't access it yourself. I'm just looking at the chat. I did find out what's behind my reluctance to say something in public. It's fear of violence toward me, and knowing that has helped me put in perspective. Oh, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Someone else says in the chat, what stuck out for me is the interconnectedness of white and Black lives in spite of our perceptions of separateness and segregation. Yeah. So the reading itself talks a lot about that in terms of like, what is it that we can see as our shared struggle, and the importance of understanding that that mutual relationship, that mutual accountability for us as white people in fighting against racism, and that there is freedom and liberation for white people from white supremacy as well. While the impact of white supremacy on us looks different, it still impacts us. It means that we lose part of our humanity, that we lose a connection to our own histories and backgrounds because it has been sort of dissipated and invisibilized to make us all sort of the same, that we're all from the US and we ascribe to white US culture, which has really made it difficult for white folks to have a connection to their own historical and community backgrounds. Not for folks who've more recently immigrated from European countries, for example, or even Canada, et cetera, but for folks who maybe more historically in our past came from England or Germany or Ireland? How have we sort of lost the connection to that as a result of white supremacy and really wanting to make us all the same, so that we were a concerted effort against people of color and Black folks in particular in this country? Someone else posted, oh, a couple of folks are sharing in the chat. Thank you so much for that. Some next steps are to learn more, take the time to watch videos and read books and articles and blogs. Someone else said, really appreciated the breakdown in the blog of spiritual interest, cultural interest, and material interest. Yes, so the blog is really asking for folks to think about what is your interest around spirituality, cultural, and material interest of divesting in white supremacy. So taking your investment out of the continued perpetuation of it. Someone said, after reading the article and listening to the podcast, I'll refrain from labeling myself as an ally or anti-racist and allow my actions and those around me to decide. Yes, thank you. So we talked about this last week, this idea that I don't get to decide for myself if I'm anti-racist or if I am an ally. That's really determined by those around me who witness and are, participants or encouragers or even frustrated by the actions that I engage in. And so I have to earn that title, and I have to earn it every day, every minute of every day in the actions that I engage in. It's not somewhere where I've arrived. And so we talked about that last week as well. Someone else shares that reflection on the podcast. I appreciated Robin's call to notice discomfort in the moment and sit without trying to fix or make it go away. I also appreciated Resma's wish for white people to do the work so they don't pass on white superiority to their children. I found myself wanting more guidance on how to talk to my children about these issues and encouraging their openness and understanding, particularly when they're too young to understand the historical context. Yes, thank you so much for that. I do feel like we could do an entire series on parenting and anti-racism, because it's a whole nother situation, right? I have a 9-year-old daughter myself, and it is very complicated to try to explain things to her that are way bigger than her little brain right now is able to comprehend. And so we take it slow, and we have had conversations since she was 3. And it starts to build, and she's starting to develop an understanding that's more complex, but it's small and it takes time and a lot of seed planting, and allowing her to kind of engage in the conversation in a way that's fits with her capacity at the moment, and then coming back to it and revisiting. So, maybe we think about that as another series down the road, because it is a whole nother thing that I feel like people really do want to talk about. Someone asked, can you comment on the need to dismantle patriarchy and hierarchy as a critical piece of achieving true equality? Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation also. There's so many things that we could talk about, and certainly the complexities of this are really endless. And so I think that when we think about the need to dismantle patriarchy and hierarchy as a critical piece of achieving equality, we're talking a little bit about intersectionality and this idea that there are multiple systems in our society that create hierarchical structures that make it very difficult for us to achieve actual equality. One of those, and a fundamental one, in addition to racism, is patriarchy and the idea of hierarchy, and that there is some structure of power that actually supports our society rather than causes harm. And so many of the ways that our society is structured actually does continue to cause harm. And patriarchy is one of those. And so the patriarchal and more paternalistic structure actually is one that reinforces this idea that we know better than someone else, and we have the answers, and therefore we're going to tell you what the world should look like in order for it to be equitable. And unless we break that down and see that everyone has a stake and a role in defining equality for themselves, there is no one sort of person or people or group of people who knows best, which is a very patriarchal perspective, that we're never going to actually achieve that equality. There are a couple other comments. The podcast left me feeling that I don't know what to do and I'm afraid to make a mistake. How do I figure out how to show up in a way that's meaningful and appropriate? So appreciate that. Thank you for saying that. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. And if at the end you feel like you're still wondering, let's keep talking about it, because there is no way that we won't make mistakes, and how do we deal with that? What are the ways in which we build our own resiliency to address some of those challenges? I see a question in the Q&A. Have you read and or would you suggest My Grandmother's Hands? I was very impressed by Resma's knowledge of trauma coupled with his mindfulness around the use of language from both on his own On Being interviews. Yeah, I have not read that book, but I was really curious when I heard him mention that. So I definitely am going to check that out. A general question is the person of color or people of color still an okay term to use? Or should I transition to using solely BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C? Yeah, it's a great question. There are lots of complexities with our language. Language is so limited often in allowing for the nuances and complexity of these issues. So people of color is something that I use occasionally in talking about groups of people of color in terms of like thinking about systems of oppression broadly and talking about racism. BIPOC has emerged to kind of highlight and center the experiences of Black and Indigenous people of color because there is sort of a unique history in the US context around Black and Indigenous folks. And I will say that Indigenous folks often includes Mexican Indigenous who were a part of this country before we moved the border further south. So, that I think in terms of Indigenous and indigeneity includes that as well. I think that some of the challenges around people of color is that it doesn't allow for the individual complexity of what individual groups of color experience, and that not all people of color experience racism in the same way. That it does exist for all groups, but it doesn't show up in the same way, and the implications and impacts of those aren't quite the same. So I would say that the trend is leaning towards like BIPOC as a more commonly used terminology, especially to highlight some of those unique experiences. But I don't know that people are sort of wholeheartedly deciding that people of color is not okay. I think we have to think about under what circumstances are we using that language and what's the purpose of that, and how do we make sure we are highlighting that people of color is not a monolith and not everyone within that umbrella really experiences things in the same way. And certainly that's true even if we're talking about Black folks or Indigenous folks or Latinx folks, et cetera. So language is always changing and complicated, and just being really aware and thoughtful as you use it, especially if people respond and say, hey, I really prefer a different term, then shifting your language to reflect that preference. A couple more questions and then we'll move forward from the homework. Knowing I'm behind on a lot of this, there are certain book I should start reading. There's so many out there. I really want to start with a right one, or is there a right one? Great question. I am someone who, like, I think books are really helpful in sparking conversation, and I think they're really useful in helping us kind of find a place to start. It really depends on what you want to know. So I think there's been some critiques of Robin DiAngelo's book on white fragility, which is fair and understandable, and books are books and they're always going to have their limitations in the sense that they're somewhat static, right? They put them out there and things change. And so I would say that if you want to learn about white fragility and some of the dynamics of white people, her book is pretty good. There's some other ones that are Cheryl Matthias, who is Dr. Cheryl Matthias, who is a critical whiteness scholar at, she used to be at the University of Colorado in Denver, but has moved to the South. I think she's in Kentucky or something, but her book is called Feeling White. That's a really good one. I have countless suggestions that we can make sure that we send out maybe a resource list that offers folks some sense of where to go that's not too overwhelming, and maybe gives you a little bit of categorization of what kinds of books to focus on. And the last question, oh yeah, I have been hearing some criticisms from the Black community towards Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility book. Will there be space to dive into that during the whiteness portion of today's call? Yeah, we can certainly talk about it. I think that some of what I've seen, there is one very prominent article that's being shared right now that is written by a Black man who writes for conservative publications and is very critical of Robin DiAngelo's book as being patronizing to Black folks in the way that she talks about whiteness and the power dynamics of whiteness and Blackness in this country. So there's also a critique of his critique as being a man from a very conservative background who writes for very conservative publications, and also sort of focuses a little bit more on the blaming of the Black community for things that are really systemic issues. So I think if you're seeing that article, I would Google his other writings just to get a sense of where he's coming from with that critique. Not that it's not valid. Some of the things in that article I think he says are actually very valid, but there are some critiques of that critique. As you know, as the society we live in, we like to critique lots of things. So yes, and then I think there's other critiques of Robin DiAngelo around her being a little bit patronizing, which I mentioned last week, and talked about how some of you might have noticed that in the podcast. There was a little bit of that in my mind as I was listening to it, where I felt like how she was speaking felt somewhat patronizing. So I think folks have talked about that before. Oh yeah, someone shared, thank you so much, I could not remember his name. John McWhorter from Columbia University did the critique of DiAngelo, and it's McWhorter. And when I saw his critique, I went and Googled his other work and realized that that it was someone that other people have critiques of, so I put that in there. And then someone mentioned how much Robin DiAngelo was speaking. Yeah, she spoke a lot. So Resma had less time and space to speak. So that's another aspect of it. So certainly, you know, white folks writing books and articles about racism have been somewhat critiqued in terms of like, can we find people of color who are writing about this and who have been for decades and centuries about whiteness? And certainly, yes, absolutely. I think that there's something about white people hearing from other white people that that resonates a little bit differently, and we can talk about that too. It has a lot to do with, unless you're already on board and feel like you're willing to accept what folks of color are saying, you sometimes are more inclined to listen to someone who shares your identity because you don't assume that they have some agenda in telling you something like this. So, for example, white men learning about sexism, or men learning about sexism and talking about sexism to other men, is often more received than women trying to educate men about sexism, right? Because we're seen as sort of self-serving. And the same can be true for folks of color. So, so I would say that, you know, for some folks, listening to a white person talk about race and racism is helpful. And in other cases, you know, and once they're down the road and able to be more open to perspectives on race and racism and whiteness, I do think reading about folks of color writing about this is really important. Like James Baldwin, you know, going back to folks who wrote about it, Malcolm X, early on. And Cheryl Matthias is a woman of color who wrote the Feeling White book. Oh, and someone recommended Me and White Supremacy by Layla Said, which is, yes, a really good book. White Rage and White Fragility is really good. So there's a lot of stuff that we can share from the chat that folks are sharing. So I really appreciate that. I'm just checking the chat to see if there's anything that I should comment on before we move forward. So just give me 1 second. Oh, I was gonna say the comment on being uncomfortable and just noticing uncomfortableness. Yeah, so today we're gonna talk a little bit about that, the importance of recognizing when you're feeling discomfort. How do you reconnect to your body as best you can and really notice what's happening? That sort of embodiment and sense of self-awareness is really important as we talk more about what happens when we're called in or called out around something we did, and what are we noticing that's going on in our bodies, and how can we reconnect to that and breathe through it so that we're able to not sort of disconnect and try to ignore that and run away from it. Someone also mentions, I was thinking a lot about how this has led to Celtic Reconstructionist, paganism, Gaelic reclamation. Yeah, our history was largely destroyed and told by others, and that white supremacy asked us to further disconnect from the communalism and gender fluidity and spirituality of those cultures. Absolutely, 100%. Thank you for saying that, yeah. Anything else? Great. Yeah, we should definitely send out some resources to you all. We really appreciate you offering some of these comments and suggestions. I so appreciate you doing the homework. Thank you. Today's homework is actually a little bit more simple. I don't know, maybe not simple, but it's a little more action oriented. So that'll be fun to see folks commit to that and do that for next week, which we can talk about. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving forward. We're going to talk today about whiteness and white fragility. And I just want to say that in today's workshop, we are sort of premising this, and I talked about this last week, so we're not here to argue whether or not race and racism exists. That's not what this conversation is. It's a little bit of more of the, it exists, what do we do now? So for today, the assumptions that I'm making and coming to you with this is that we live in a world which has been foundationally shaped by white supremacy, racism, colonization, and other systems of oppression. That racism manifests both individually and systemically and must be interrupted on all levels. We talked a little bit about that last week. The responsibility for disrupting white supremacy and racism belongs to white people. So that just means that we have to have ownership over this, that we can't see ourselves as separate and apart from the struggle for racial justice. It's not something that's solely on folks who are experiencing it, that we have to take ownership over that. And so that's an assumption that I'm making in coming to you with this content today. I do want to revisit a little bit of how we defined white supremacy last week, just in case folks are new today, that I want to just clarify that when we talk about white supremacy, we're not talking about only the folks who are white supremacist hate groups and the alt-right and wearing hoods and all of those things. Those things exist. They're important to consider and talk about. But white supremacy has been used in many contexts and so can be confusing. And so when we talk about white supremacy culture, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as what we think of when we think of KKK and white supremacists. They're not entirely unrelated, although when we talk about it in this way, we can kind of create a backlash because people are distancing themselves from those sort of alt-right, very prominent and very visible acts of racism. And so people have a really hard time aligning themselves with that, right? So they're saying, we don't think of ourselves as aligning with KKK, therefore we aren't perpetuating white supremacy. But we have to find a way to describe it that's about the nuances and the subtle ways that whiteness shows up in our culture. That's not about those overt actions and behaviors, but more of the nuances of cultural norms and dominant lenses and perspectives. And so it's a system within which whites overwhelmingly control political, social, and economic power, widespread entitlement to powerful spaces, as well as cultural patterns that are considered the norm. And that's the norm that by and to which all other patterns are measured and compared. So essentially what we're saying is there are elements of whiteness where we say, this is the norm, and if you do not function along that norm, you're seen as other, or you're seen as outside of that cultural context. And so you could be seen as less than, not as successful as, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll dig more into this next week because it is a bit of a complicated conversation. And I don't know if folks have seen, and I don't have the reference for this, so my chat monitor folks, if you Google it and find it, let me know. But the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., I think just today, very soon before I started this webinar, article was posted that in the museum, there was a couple of panels that talked about white supremacy culture and the culture of whiteness. And they got a lot of pushback from conservative folks and were forced to take it down. And that's really unfortunate to me. And I think part of it is because when we talk about white supremacy, there's miscommunication in terms of how white people receive it. We tend to say like, oh, well, this just means we're all bad and everything about us is horrible. Oh, thank you so much, Carrie. And not everything about us is horrible, right? So, there are aspects of white supremacy culture that are deeply problematic and things that we really need to make sure that we're addressing. And there are things that are just, about the norms that we've created. Now, the cultural piece of that is just saying that when we lift this up as the way to be, one of them is perfectionism, which we'll talk about today. When we lift perfectionism up as the way to be, then anyone who doesn't ascribe to perfectionism is considered to be less than. That includes white people. So if there are white people who are not perfectionists, right, we are still seen as sort of counterculture, but we're not penalized in the same way as folks of color who are not ascribing to that perfectionistic perspective. And I also think that there's another aspect of it that's really complicated to engage in conversation. And so actually someone just commented on this in the chat, I see, but like when you look at the information that they took down, some of it might have been poorly worded and patronizing towards Black folks, which really surprised this individual. And for example, white people value hard work. So yes, so here's the complexity, which we'll talk about next week. But when you talk about white supremacy culture, the hard work thing comes from a Puritan work ethic, which essentially said that when you are working, you are closer to God. And so therefore, anyone who isn't working isn't godly. And anyone who struggles around that is seen as less than and not achieving godliness. And so it's complicated, but when we get into that realm, we start to negate anyone who doesn't sort of function along that particular line. It's not necessarily about hard work, but a very specific way of articulating what work looks like and what it means. So in the chat, your comment is exactly right. The nuances and the complexities of that is really missing when we don't have the ability to have a conversation about what each of those aspects of white culture mean and look like. What's the historical context for that? How has that been used to marginalize folks? And that even is rooted in sort of work ethical issues in England and in Europe. So anyway, again, could spend tons of time on that. We'll try to come back to that next week, but wanted to come back to this conversation about and definition of white supremacy so that there's a grounding for how we move forward today, at least. So how do we disrupt white supremacy? So we have to acknowledge that white supremacy and racism are not just individual acts, but systemic and institutionalized. Holding an awareness of one's own privileged or dominant identities and learning more about the dynamics of white supremacy and how they show up. And then showing up with accountability and challenging both individual and collective acts and the impact of white supremacy. Now, all of this is a lot of words and it doesn't give us specific behavioral elements of that. And so I will talk about those things. So move to the next slide. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about white fragility. And white fragility, as defined by Robin DiAngelo, but certainly written about and spoken about by folks of color prior to her using this term and titling her book this, is just this idea that there's a state in which even a minimal amount of racial stress becomes intolerable for white people, triggering a range of defensive moves. The display of emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-induced situation. And these behaviors function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. And so essentially it's saying that when we have to engage in difficult conversations about racism, we sort of fall apart, that we have very little ability to bounce back and be resilient, that there's sort of like this strong desire to like run away. And there's lots of research on this in terms of like what's happening in our brains and you know, some neurological things that are happening around flight and fight and all of those kinds of things. But today we're just going to focus on the fact that this happens. And so because it happens, what do we do and how do we sort of think about what the next step might look like? So we're going to talk about accountability and shame. Because that's a very strong component of white fragility. And we'll come back to the white fragility definition in a minute. And for folks who were not here last time, we will take a break. So my clock right now says 2:41. Around 3 o'clock, we'll take like a 10 minute break to allow folks to stretch and know that being on Zoom this long can be a lot for folks. So we're going to talk a little bit about accountability because it relates to white fragility. So accountability is the act of being answerable for our decisions and actions, both individually and collectively. And accountability is built through collaborative relationships and working together. So we have to be willing to show up, listen, acknowledge, and learn from our mistakes, and move forward and continue to show up for racial justice. There's also elements of this around rebuilding trust, and you know, repairing relationships, and we can talk about that as well. But really fundamentally, it's how do we show up, how do we listen, and acknowledge when something doesn't go right, and then how do we keep moving forward. And one of the key elements of this accountability, right, is that we're sort of looking at how do we go from point A to point B. We have this relationship or groups, right? It can be groups or it can be systemic too. But in this case, we're going to talk just a little bit more individually. And we say, you know, person A did something and person B called them on it and said, hey, what you did hurt me or was inappropriate or challenged to me or was painful or harmful. And the goal is really just to acknowledge and learn from a mistake and continue to show up. So when we're accountable, that's really what we're aiming for, is how do we acknowledge and learn from what we did and then continue to show up and move on. So what gets in the way of that? So what gets in the way of accountability is shame and fragility. And we're talking specifically about the context of racial justice and racism and whiteness. And so when we think about this idea of accountability and shame, we're thinking about when someone calls us to task and asks us to be accountable for something, someone says to you, hey, what you said really hurt me. We have this interruption, right, of shame and fragility that says many things. And we'll talk about this in a minute in terms of like what your own reactions are. But it could be, oh no, I'm a terrible person. Oh no, I'm not smart enough, or I just did something horrible and now I feel horrible about myself. I am really embarrassed. So all of these things tend to come up, which prevents us from actually just owning the behavior, apologizing for what we did, and figuring out how to move forward. And so this shame piece is what comes in as well. So for accountability, we're looking towards how do we respond, acknowledge the behavior, and move forward. The interruption of that process is this shame piece. So shame is a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consciousness of wrong or foolish behavior. And Brene Brown, which I'm bringing in quite a bit today, and you know, people can have their own feelings about Brene Brown, and there's lots of critiques of her work, especially as it relates to racial justice, but she really speaks to vulnerability and shame in a way that I think can connect very deeply to the idea of white fragility and white people's challenge with anti-racism work. Brene has recently started bringing in more conversations about this into her work. Initially, she was not talking about this in the context of racism, but she talks about how shame derives its power from being unspeakable. So instead of owning our shame and saying, in this relationship, when I did something that was harmful to you, maybe I asked you, I touched your hair without your permission, or I asked you where you were from and didn't know that that was offensive to you. Instead of owning that shame and feeling embarrassed and just saying, you know what, I'm so embarrassed that I did that, I really apologize, it won't happen again, and just moving on, the shame spiral happens, right? Where it's just this perpetual, self-flagellation, for lack of a better term, that's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. I'm a terrible person. I can't believe I did that. I'm such a horrible person. I can't believe I did that. So we go into the shame spiral that then prevents us from actually just being accountable and figuring out how to move forward. This is all very understandable, y'all. Like, I think a lot of times when we're talking about, this issue, we feel like it's not okay to feel these things. And that's not at all what I'm saying. I think it's important that we acknowledge that this is what's happening so that we can understand how to fix it or change it, or even just deal with it, right? The fixing, it's a human response to feel this way. So it's more about what do we do with it as opposed to judging it. And it looks like someone asked a question about the handouts on accountability and shame. Yes, so you can have access to the PDF, and I will try to go slower. Thank you for commenting about that. I can sometimes talk fast. I'm trying to kind of set up the stage for understanding what white fragility means and how it prevents us from moving forward, because it interrupts that accountability process, and that's the problem, right? So I appreciate you pointing out that. I'll slow down and make sure folks are following. So shame is this piece of interruption that comes in the way of us being accountable for things that we've done or said. And so how do we figure out what to do with that? And then I want to make a comment too about shame. So often we assume that shame is because someone said something to us in a certain way. But shame is not about other people inherently shaming us. It's not about what others say to us and whether or not they could have said it differently. It's about how we respond to what people say to us, regardless of how they say it to us. So a lot of times what we hear, right, and I'm sure many of you on this call have heard or felt this way, is, well, if they had just said it to me nicer, or if they weren't so angry with me, I would have been fine. I wish you had been, less confrontational or not shown up with so much anger, and I would have been able to apologize. But that's putting a lot of responsibility on the person who has been harmed to figure out how they're supposed to respond to that harm in a way that takes care of your feelings, rather than us just taking ownership over our own feelings and how we can be okay in that moment. And so while our marginalized identities are really incredibly important as well, while we're working on privileged identities, so for example, me being a white woman, I often want to revert to the fact that my marginalized status is being a woman, but that doesn't negate my privileged identity as whiteness. So if I'm being confronted with something around race and racism, I need to be really careful that I'm not sort of inserting my marginalized identity as a woman to offset my responsibility and addressing my privilege as a white woman. And so all of that stuff is this like kind of messy goo that we're dealing with when we're trying to engage in difficult conversations about these issues. So there is a question in the chat about, isn't it even worse when white people comfort the person who feels shame? So I think what you mean is that, yes, I think what you mean is that when someone is called out on something and then people rush to comfort the person who felt that shame. So I'll give you an example. I was working in an organization where one of my white colleagues sent out an email, and it was to the entire organization of 130 people. And in the email, she mixed up two Black women's names. So she used the wrong Black woman's name in place of the actual Black woman she was speaking to. And it was very public, so everyone saw it. It was a very public microaggression, a mistake. And a lot of people rushed to support the white woman who had committed that microaggression, and made sure she was okay and that she felt okay. And I think that there are times when we can support each other as white people, right? When we make mistakes, it feels horrible. This person felt terrible. Of course, it was a mistake. It was just a mistake, and she should have paid closer attention, and it still did harm, and it still had the impact it had. And so I think that it's important that we figure out what is the reason for the comforting, what is the reason we reach out to that person who committed that microaggression or that harm. Are we trying to support them in accountability around like, hey, you know what, I've been there before, I've made a mistake too, let's hold each other accountable and make sure we don't do this again? Or is it like, oh my gosh, you did that, I'm so sorry, I hope people aren't attacking you, right? Like more of a colluding in whiteness as we sort of comfort each other. So I think that there is a place for supporting folks through the accountability process. I think that we have to be careful about the purpose and the reason for that. And so I think that there's an element of making sure that we're not expecting that someone is going to shift the way they call us on something in order to protect our feelings. We have a responsibility to hear feedback in whatever way it's given and be able to manage and deal with that. Now, most of the time it's given in a way that's, hard to hear, but not necessarily, overtly past the point of something we can manage. And so I think we tend to make an assumption that it's more harmful to have someone angry at us, right? then looking at the fact that their anger is warranted and what we did was really harmful. And so how do we stop focusing so much on our own feelings about it and recognize that the harm we cause is something we have to figure out how to repair. And that's a part of the shame piece, is getting beyond that shame to recognize the impact of what we did and how to move forward. Okay, just making sure there were no questions. So an element of this also, so there's lots of complex pieces to this that I'm trying to tease out a little bit so that when we start to talk about what to do, you can kind of touch on what's happening for me right now. So I have an accountability issue. Someone asked me to be accountable. I did something. What is happening? Am I being shameful? Am I feeling vulnerable? Do I have perfectionism? Maybe it's all of it. But how do we sort of understand the makeup of white fragility and whiteness to be able to understand what to do with it? So perfectionism is a piece of that too. And this is an element that comes out in white culture documents where it talks about what is white culture. And in white culture, we have this belief in perfectionism, that everything has to be perfect. Mistakes are seen as personal. They reflect badly on the person making them, as opposed to being seen for what they are, just mistakes. Making a mistake is confused with being a mistake, doing wrong with being wrong. So not just I made a mistake and I have to figure out how to handle that and move forward, but now that I made a mistake, everyone thinks I'm a racist and a horrible person and I'll never get over that. And oh my gosh, like now I'm terrible and horrible and awful. This is also complicated because it's a lot around how we're socialized, especially for people who are socialized as females and white women. We are taught very much that our mistakes are very personal to who we are. And so we have to figure out, how do we heal some of that so that when we make a mistake, we don't see it as I'm a mistake. That's a whole nother webinar we can talk about another time, but it's a lot about healing and what that actually looks like for us around whiteness. There's a question and I will get to it in 1 second. I'm just going to read this last bullet point and then I will comment. Little time and energy or money is put into reflection or identifying lessons learned that can improve practice. In other words, little or no learning from mistakes. So it's like, well, I made a mistake and oh, well, I made a mistake and it was bad, but like, I don't have to fix it, right? And so there's other elements of perfectionism in white culture, which we'll talk about next week, but these were the ones that were really relevant to the specific thing we're talking about today. In the Q&A, there's a question on how do you handle accountability if you give feedback when folks of dominant cultures are unwilling to take responsibility for the impact and defend it? For instance, if they claim that it's simply a matter of personal beliefs such as faith. Yeah, I mean, great question. It's really tough to handle accountability when folks are not willing to take responsibility for the impact. There is very little that we can do. It really depends too on the context, like who is this person, how much power do they have over you, over the situation, over what's happening. Is there accountability for them? Like, is there a process for holding them accountable? Like if it's an organization, a board of directors or something like that. And so a lot of times accountability is important in the context of relationships. So what is our relationship to this person? Do they have a reason to care that they made a mistake and something happened? Are there implications for community, like the community they serve? So let's say they're a faith community. What does it mean for their faith community if they're not accountable for their decision and what they are their behavior? And so I think if I come across people who are unwilling to take responsibility in their positions of power, then I think you look towards other accountability structures, community pressure, power pressure, other aspects of power and how we organize to get people to be accountable for what they've done. So that could look like, public campaigns, social media campaigns. It could be meetings, like community meetings where you're sort of holding folks accountable. It could be, organizing structures or direct action. So when we get into the big picture process of how we hold systems accountable, and individuals within those systems, we get into concepts around organizing and structural change, which is complicated and often comes with decisions around how much energy and effort and power do you have to make a change in this context, and how do you move forward in figuring that out. There's another question. I'm just going to read it to myself really quick. That's an interesting question. Thank you for sharing that. It says, I've been reflecting a lot on white individuals, especially cis heterosexual white men. So white men whose gender aligns with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So they're not transgender, but they're cisgender. Understanding the facts of racial injustice versus having empathy towards those who have experienced race-based oppression. Do you think that being truly empathetic requires having experienced some intersectionality or oppression personally? It's such a good question. I don't know if I have the answer. And certainly I'm sure other folks have a perspective on this. So do you think you can be truly empathetic if you have never experienced some sort of oppression personally versus just kind of knowing, like intellectually knowing? And I don't know. I want to say no, because saying yes feels very cynical, and I'm a very cynical person, so I try to fight that as much as I can. And so I think when I think like it's impossible to be empathetic unless you've personally experienced something that feels like we're lacking some humanity there, that I think I want to kind of resist admitting, but I don't know for sure. You know, I used to do work in rape crisis, and there was a lot of times when I had survivors ask me if I had personally ever experienced sexual violence, because the assumption was if I hadn't, how could I possibly understand what they were going through? And I think it's a similar question of like, can you be helpful to someone experiencing some kind of trauma, racial trauma or otherwise, without having been through it? And I want to say that I think we can, but I think we have to be willing to really sort of embody what that is like and understand that at sort of a visceral, like embodied emotional level, rather than just this intellectual level that we tend to stay at as white folks in particular, but certainly as people who don't experience marginalization. So that would be my short response to that question, but I appreciate the question very much. We did have a question during the break that I wanted to make sure that I commented on. So we had a question of how, can you talk about tokenism? And there was a comment about sort of making a choice to invite someone to participate in an activity out of interest in diversity, and also because you value someone. When this person realized that she was the only person of color, she was offended. And I would have liked much more diversity, but did not want to exclude her out of fear that this could happen. Yeah, so there are a couple of things to say about this. And one is probably less helpful because it's less outside of our control, which is that when we exist in spaces that are predominantly white, we will inevitably be tokenizing someone when we invite them to the table, right? So the answer is to not have predominantly white spaces so that when folks are invited, there's a multitude of folks participating, and it's not seen as like, I was invited because I carry X identity. And so that answer isn't as helpful, because sometimes we're in spaces where that's not happening, or maybe we don't have control over that happening because we're not the ones who organized it, or we're not the director of that organization, or we're not, we're not in a community that has very much diversity, and so therefore we're sort of looking at the same people. There are certainly communities all over the country that have very few folks of color, and so those folks are always asked to be the ones to show up. This happens a lot in my work, and certainly in nonprofits. We get a lot of, many of my friends are like, I got asked to be on another board again because I'm the only like Black queer person in this town, and everybody wants me to be on their board. And so in some instances, it's a very common thing, and people are, it happens really often. That doesn't mean it's good. It just means people, it's not a surprise when it happens. I think the other thing to think about is, what's the function of it? What's the purpose? Why are you asking someone to be there? Are they involved from the beginning? Is it an authentic involvement? Does that person actually have expertise or knowledge or experience in the area that you're talking about? Or are you just saying like, oh, as a person from X identity, I think you have a perspective on this, without really knowing whether or not they do. Like maybe they don't. We can't really assume that for anyone. I think the other part of that is like, how do we involve people from the beginning? How do we really think about that inclusion from the start, and really having a multitude of voices as best we can in the process? And I think that being aware that we're sort of putting folks in a position to share their stories or talk about their lives at the benefit, or, you know, of people who are a part of that dominant cultural narrative. So let me give you an example, because sometimes when we talk about this in the abstract, it can be a little bit confusing. So we were talking about doing a conversation about social work and policing, because recently there's been a lot of discussion about how social workers are involved in or being encouraged to be involved in policing now that we're looking at defunding as an option. So that's a whole nother conversation. But we were talking about this, and one of my colleagues was like, well, we should have a storytelling session where folks who are system impacted by the criminal justice system come and talk to our community about their experiences in criminal justice. And one of my other colleagues was like, so you want to have probably mostly Black and brown folks come to our community of mostly white social workers and tell their story of being criminally impacted, you know, criminal justice system impacted. And like, how is that not sort of a tokenizing thing where we're asking folks to again come and engage in emotional labor to share their story for the benefit of a community that doesn't experience that issue? And what does that mean for the folks who are there having to tell that story again and again for the benefit of someone with those privileges? And the person that recommended it was like, oh my gosh, you know, I didn't even think about that. So it wasn't like she intentionally thought of it. It wasn't something that she was doing to, you know, to perpetuate harm. It was an ignorance comment and something that she just didn't think about. And so we had to really talk about like shifting that perspective and what are other ways we can think about it. And that doesn't mean that folks shouldn't have agency in making that choice, right? Like if in that instance, there are folks who want to tell their story and that's what they've chosen to do and have participated in that willingly, then they have agency to do that. And so taking that away is also very patronizing and paternalistic, but we have to be clear about what we're asking of them, right? So saying our community is predominantly white. We have mostly white women social workers. And so if you were to come, this is the audience you would be speaking to, and we recognize that this is the dynamic it's setting up. Is that something you feel like you want to do or not? Or are you paying folks for that? Like, are you paying them for their time and their emotional labor? Or are you asking them to volunteer? Knowing that when they leave that situation, they're not just leaving, they're sort of carrying with them all the burden of whatever happened in that space, being one of the only people of color or the only person of color who had to share their experience and have white people witnessing that. And so there's just a lot of like things to consider when we're making decisions like that. And I think it's not, when we're in a situation where, let's say we work in an organization where there is only one person of color, that obviously will set us up for having tokenistic discussions and things where we invite people into conversations where it feels tokenizing. So we have to also be working to address that larger issue. Why are these spaces only white? Why are we only having one person of color available to us? What is happening to cause the circumstances under which this tokenism is occurring? And all of the complexities that come with the decision to invite folks into that space. And, you know, I hear really often from white folks that it feels like a dichotomy. It's like, we either need to learn on our own, but we don't know what we're supposed to learn and we might mess it up, or we are supposed to learn from the experiences and voices of people of color, but that's putting a burden on folks of color. And I think that I'll go back to what I mentioned last week, and some of it is that relationship really matters, and the intent and the purpose of it. What is the reason behind what you're doing? Why are you doing it? Is someone having agency over their choice in participating? Do they know what they're setting themselves up for, or you're setting them up for, or what they're getting into? And how do you sort of navigate through that with some respect and understanding of how to articulate what's really going on. So I think that's a piece of it. And then, you know, being really intentional and thoughtful, and really kind of being aware of the issues that arise in those circumstances. Let's see, if we don't have webcam or mic capabilities, will we still be able to come and participate? It's a great question. Let me see about that. Our tech person might be able to comment on that. If you're coming by phone, you can still participate. So if you're on the phone, you can participate. If you're on a computer and you're somehow just watching it, you might have more difficulty, but you can call in. So if you come next week and you want to participate, you should be able to call in, but we can talk more about that and answer it with more specific information in the Q&A box. Someone else says, isn't this an example of what Resma talked about in the podcast? He didn't choose to share his intimate experience, and white people should do that work ourselves. Yeah. So like, again, I don't know the circumstances under the question, so I'm not sure why you invited this person into that space. If it's about learning about racism, then I think you should really think about who and why you're inviting them into the space, and like what kind of emotional labor and impact and trauma that can create for someone who is like the only person of color in that space. If you're talking about, like, I had a meeting and it was like, and you know, we were trying to brainstorm a programmatic idea and we only have one person of color as our staff person, you know, I would ask the question of like, how have they been involved up till this point? Like, are their voices valued all the time, not just in certain instances? And so there's lots of things to consider and nuances and complexities depending on the context of the situation and the relationship. But I think in general, when we're talking about learning about racism, then in many cases, it's important for white people to do the work ourselves. There are some folks who critique that because white people can mess that up. So you have to do that in accountability with folks of color who can tell you if you're doing something incorrectly or wrong, or that's perpetuating harm, but you have to have a relationship to that person or that group or that organization that's led by folks of color, so that that accountability relationship isn't one directional, and it's not sort of exploitive of somebody who might not even know you or know your investment in the work. So we can talk about that when we get into allyship during the fourth session, just like, what do those accountability relationships look like, and how do you develop them, and, you know, how do you really take direction from, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color groups, where they're both instructing white people on how to show up, but also want us to be able to do our own work without waiting for them to tell us what to do. And there's just like, it's a little bit of like learning how to just navigate, you know, complex relationships and situations where you're dealing with a lot of dynamics that are at play. And I promise that if it feels overwhelming to you right now, it's not as overwhelming as it seems once you get into those relationships and you really start learning more about how to do this with intention and thoughtfulness, which is just sometimes, I think, it feels overwhelming to folks when you haven't been in that space before. So I appreciate the question. Is it accurate to group all white people with the same stereotypical behaviors as, for example, the notion of perfectionism? That is such a great question. One of the things that Robin DiAngelo talks about in her group is that white people get very uncomfortable when we assume that we know anything about them or us just solely based on their whiteness. But we do that to other people, right? So other groups of people, we assume, not we as in us individually, but as a culture, right? We assume that we can determine the characteristics or behaviors of a group of people of color based on one specific aspect or example. We do this a lot when we think about Islamophobia, right? One person or 5 people or whatever engage in some kind of behavior that's harmful or hurtful or violent. And so therefore we just assume that everyone who is Muslim is the same way. And rarely as white people do we have that happen to us, where people assume that all white people are one particular way. And so when we have that happen, it feels like it rubs us the wrong way because we're not used to it. And certainly what we can say, and what I mentioned when I talked about white supremacy culture, is that not everyone ascribes to those things. Some people of color do, because we're acculturated in the same environment. So when we're acculturated in white supremacy culture, everyone is impacted by that cultural dominant norm. Some people ascribe to it more than others, and that's true across identity groups, right? But the penalization for not ascribing to it looks very different for people of color than it does for white folks. So for white folks who are not perfectionistic, we aren't held accountable at the same rate. I see this in organizations all the time. White people who are not perfectionists in their work are seen as not as contributing to the organization as much as folks who do ascribe to that, but they're often not put on probation and fired as quickly as people of color who maybe aren't ascribing to that norm of perfectionism in the same way. And so that's where we start to see the implications of that. And so when we ascribe all those behaviors to white culture, we're talking about a cultural norm, not necessarily that everyone within it ascribes to that cultural norm individually. Yeah, so someone says, be willing to compensate folks if they agree to participate. So talking about the people tokenizing and how we bring people into the work. Yes, 100%. If you're asking folks to show up and put their own story out there for your benefit, even if it's just like learning from them, you should compensate them. And organizations don't do this really often, and it's not okay. You should, if you are asking someone to show up and tell you their story at the benefit of you learning, then you should pay them for that. Someone in the, sorry, I'm jumping between comments because I think people are commenting on one thing and then the other. There's a question in the chat about perfectionism, I think. Is it a class norm? Yes, it is a class norm. And intersectionality and how our identities as white folks and middle class or upper middle class or wealthy white folks all intertwines and to create this sort of complex web of cultural norms that are hard to tease out in terms of class and race and even gender. It starts to get very complicated in there. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay. So we're going to go back a little bit to this conversation about white fragility and perfectionism and move into the last, we have about 30 minutes left. So we talked about perfectionism and this piece of like just wanting to get everything right. I'm a perfectionist. I really struggle with things that I'm not good at, and it's tough for me. So this has been something I've had to really, really push myself on. And in the last probably 10 years or so, have really found ways to kind of allow myself to not be a perfectionist and make mistakes and be okay with it. But it takes work. And I see it in my daughter. So that's also something where I'm like, oh no, she inherited this part and probably culturally learned it from our household, but have really worked hard from the moment she was born to figure out how to focus on a learning culture as opposed to an achievement perfectionistic culture in our family. So I'm coming back to the definition of white fragility in case it's gotten lost in lots of the discussion that we've been having. So again, going back to this idea that shame, an example of shame and how shame shows up is this idea of white fragility. And so it's when we sort of avoid conversations or don't want to participate, leave the room, cry, excuse ourselves, etc. I will say that crying is not necessarily a sole function of white fragility, except when it's used to remove yourself from discomfort. So it's normal to cry about racism and the horrific things that have happened. Like if we disconnect from our feelings of deep just sadness and despair that this is happening to folks that we love and care about and just other humans, then we should feel sad about those things. But when we're in a situation where someone is confronting us about our own behavior around racism and we cry to avoid accountability or discomfort, it's used as a way to get out of a difficult situation as opposed to an authentic expression of sadness. And there is nuance there in terms of how that shows up, right? So I think if your reaction is like, well, I cry and what's wrong with that? Really think about like, what's the function of the crying in that moment? Is it to really deeply express that you are sad that you did something that hurt someone else and you're sitting in that sadness while being accountable? Or are you trying to use it to like excuse yourself from that challenge and difficult conversation? And so when I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of an opportunity to think about shame and fragility. So we've been talking a lot about this, and this might have already come up for folks. And certainly I think some of the questions in the chat are reflecting that you're thinking about your own experiences of this. but I really want you to just think of a time when you've made a mistake and ended up feeling shame. If you're brave and you really want to go into like a racial justice, sort of social justice, like racist example, great. I would love for you to do that. Sometimes it's really hard to jump there first. So if you're someone who's like, I'm not sure I'm ready to fully experience what that was like for me, just think about a time when you made a mistake, like some mistake that had an impact on someone else. I really encourage you to think about it in the context of race if you can, but think of a time when you made a mistake and ended up feeling shame. What was that like? What did you tell yourself? How did you act? And did you do something to try to work through or potentially resolve that? So what was that like? What did you tell yourself? What did you say, feel, and think? And how did you act? Oops, sorry, I apologize. So I was going to play music while we do this, but for some reason, exiting out of my full screen is not working for me. Hold on one second. So think about this for a little bit while I try to figure out if I can get music to work for y'all, so we're not just in silence. And if you have access to something, write it down, jot on a computer. If you're with someone, feel free to chat with them about this experience and just take a couple minutes to do some personal reflection. Okay, so apologies, I can't, I will figure that out before next time. But hopefully that was enough time just to kind of think a little bit about your shame and fragility responses when you're dealing with mistakes. And someone in the chat said something that, yes, I should clarify, which I did not say, but thank you so much for pointing this out. Just mentioning that crying, even without the function of using it to excuse yourself, can still put an emotional burden on BIPOC folks to care for your emotional needs. Yes. So generally speaking, like any emotional response you have obviously has an impact on the other person. And so their response necessarily is to be like, I'm sorry, I hurt, you know, I made you cry, like I want to take care of you. And so, so when we have that emotional response, we're sort of placing on the other person the need to apologize or feel bad for what it is that they asked us to shift our behavior around or to do differently. And so I think best practice is to like try to figure out how to avoid having that emotional response by learning about your body and your responses and deep breaths, and figure out how to manage those emotions in a different space, not right in the moment with that person that you're talking with. But I do think that there is some difficulty around how to figure out how to do that for folks who might be newer to the conversation. So I think as you're thinking about skill building, some of it might be to think like, what is your response? Is your response to cry? Is your response to get angry? Is your response to leave? And how do you sort of pinpoint, oh, this is my default. This is what I tend to do. So how do I build skills around not doing that in that moment? Whether it's breathing or asking for a minute, and just, you know, even in a conflict situation, you can just say, I really appreciate you pointing that out. I just want 1 minute before I respond, and just kind of breathing through that. And so, really being aware of what's happening in your body and how you tend to respond can help you kind of build some of those skills. So I appreciate pointing that out for sure. Someone also asked, is the white emotional crying still distracting from the conversation on racism? I've read articles about how this response can take away from the BIPOC voices, but is this more of what you describe as a shame response rather than sadness around horrific racist actions? Yeah, I mean, here's what I'll say. I think that when we disconnect from our feelings, it's a function of white supremacy and keeps us from actually owning the tremendous horrific impact of our racism and white supremacy on other people. That being said, I think that we have to both hold on to our emotions and figure out when and where is an appropriate time and space to deal with those emotions. That's tricky because we don't always have those spaces. And so we have to figure out how to build those spaces for ourselves. Do you have friends, colleagues, partners, family members, whatever, who are the people where you can go and express that emotion and that sadness that we need to feel about it without it being about, putting that burden of that emotion on folks of color who, not everyone, but often the response I hear is, yeah, we've been living this our whole lives. Like, your tears right now don't mean anything to me because it is our daily existence, right? So like, you crying about it is fine, but like, I don't know that I need to like manage that emotion. I think that sometimes white people take that as like, oh, don't feel emotion about it. And so I think I want to kind of blend in that nuance of like, you should feel emotional about it, but how and where we deal with that emotion is really connected to what it is that we're asking of the person talking to us about the policy, practice, behavior, action we took that might have been harmful. So I think it's really thinking critically about what are the reactions I'm having. If I feel emotional about this, which is very human, how can I like deal with the situation I'm in right now and then put my emotions aside for a second and then go feel them when you have the time and space to do that, whether it's alone or with another person. I definitely recommend finding people, which is what we'll do at the end. We need to break the isolation around whiteness and fighting racism and white supremacy by building relationships with each other, because we need to hold each other through this work and be responsible for each other in this work. And so when we don't have that space to process that emotion, what it tends to do is root itself in our bodies in a way that comes out as like resentment and anger and shame. So I think we have to find like complex and nuanced ways to deal with those emotions while also recognizing that some of them are human responses. And so skill building around that is really, really essential and important. So I think I really appreciate folks like pushing on the nuances of that. It's hard to explain all of that in a 2-hour webinar on it, but I think it's really important to name those things and make it really clear. Someone also asks about what do you think of all the BIPOC currently reaching out and sending out daily emails and other things and offering their time in the form of books and research and emails, et cetera. I think they're important resources, but not only to learn, but not only stay within white groups only. I think white spaces for processing white fragility are important. I think about it as dealing with our feelings so they're not in the way of our ability to work and help, absolutely. Yes, so I think that there's so much resources out there, y'all. Like, there's so many books and blog posts and Facebook posts of people who are sharing their daily experiences of folks of color in this country that you can just witness because they're putting them out there for public consumption, right? So in many cases, you can find TED Talks and articles and videos and all kinds of things that folks are putting out there. So you don't necessarily have to bring in a physical person who's in your space talking to white people about racism. If someone wants to do that and is making a living out of doing that, then absolutely inviting folks into your spaces and paying them for their labor. But I think it's about choice, like not removing the choice from folks, but also being very clear about what you're asking for and what the context is that they're stepping into. So I think the more we set folks up for success and understanding the situation, the better we are at actually doing that effectively, as opposed to like, surprise, here you are talking to a group of white folks about your personal story and no one knew that's what was happening, right? So it's just a very different thing to me than by having folks choose to be in that space and have agency over that choice and opt to share their story. as opposed to someone who is kind of surprised by what's happening and who's involved in that conversation. So in thinking about this shame and fragility piece, someone in the chat shared just that their example was regard to pronouns. This is one that's actually pretty similar, easy for folks to connect to, because it's a very concrete and like specific example that I think is very present for folks, is this pronoun use. And so made the mistake of misgendering someone, and when corrected felt really horrible and full of shame. Another mistake someone made was following the first mistake was to over apologize. But I learned an important lesson in kind of not centering myself and recalling trauma, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, like falling down that spiral of messiness of how we feel about ourselves. And so this person says, now when I make such a mistake with anyone, I apologize, say that we'll always work on doing better and move on. Yeah. So that's a great example in thinking about over apologizing, which is again, similar to the crying thing. It's like when we over apologize, we're putting the other person in a position of having to say, no, it's okay. You don't need to apologize. It's fine. And that's really not the focus of the conversation. And so I understand, and folks understand the sort of desire to constantly apologize, because you know that you did harm and it felt very difficult to do that. But when we constantly over apologize instead of just saying, you know what, I'm really sorry, that's not going to happen again, and move on, that actually is more about the other person than it is about us and our feelings and making us feel better. If anyone else has something you want to share about the shame and fragility, like a time when you've made a mistake, feel free to put it in the chat. What was it like? What did you tell yourself? What did you say? How did you act? Did you do something to try to work through or resolve it? I think that there's also like some acknowledgement that even when we figure out how to manage this well, it's pretty rare that we're not going to feel shame, right? Like we're going to feel shame. We hurt someone, and it's very difficult to know that that's what happened. And so shame is not necessarily going to go away, but how we manage that and learn to move past it is that important piece so that we can have that accountability. And so that's this next slide that I'm going to show, which is that what moves us towards accountability is resiliency. So resiliency is how we deal with that shame. So we have this idea of A to B, like person A does something and B person tells us like, hey, that wasn't cool. And so shame and fragility sort of interrupts that process of accountability. And what leads us back there is this idea of resiliency, of the ability to bounce back from a difficult situation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that before we close out. So resiliency is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. And it's a practice of understanding what you need to do to move beyond shame and fragility towards accountability. So if we think back to this thought exercise that we just did around fragility and shame when we made a mistake, we can think about this. When were we resilient? When was a time when you went through something difficult, a hard job transition or a job experience, a tough time at school or with family, and you felt resilient? It could be an example where you did feel resilient in the conversation or context around race and racism. But going back to, what did you do? How were you able to recover? And what support did you ask for or receive from others? So often our ability to be resilient is very reliant on how we've done it before. So looking back to, what are the things we've been able to do, or the resources that we've been able to, sort of like bring together in order for us to show up with resiliency in another context. So I think really figuring out under what circumstances were you able to show resiliency, and then using that as an opportunity to say, how can I translate those skills into this context? So maybe you had a relationship breakup that wasn't your decision, and you were very surprised by it, or you had a job transition that you weren't expecting. What was the skills and the tools that you were able to use to kind of bounce back from that experience? And how can you translate that to this context? So I think thinking about this for just a minute and identifying those specific things you did or the skills that you had in order to be resilient. Okay. So I was just going to look in the chat to see if folks are sharing. So this person says, it gives an example, but then shares, I learned to pause and think and let others bring up the conversation on how they know me in this context of work situation, especially when I'm not sure of how this much interaction has added to their new trauma. Yeah. So thinking about pausing and thinking, and then figuring out what's happening in this situation and how can I figure out how to move forward without necessarily making assumptions about what's happening. Ability to self-soothe and reach out for support, lean in and see what I can own instead of blame. Yeah, that's a great one. Like really focusing on it hurts to be called out on something, right? And so, but our tendency is to like project outward towards the person who said it, blame them and say, well, if you just said it nicer, I'd be fine. Rather than just owning like what's going on for me and what am I feeling in this moment, and then reaching out for help and figuring out how to do some self-soothing. Someone else shares, one thing that's been helpful for me is learning how to sit with those uncomfortable emotions. I let things like shame or anger or fear literally just kind of run their course through my body and consciously fight back against that defensive response. Deep breathing and other things that literally work the emotion through my physical body. I also make sure not to just keep it in, and I'm lucky to have other white folks I can process with. Yes, absolutely. Someone else says their strategy is ability to reframe, look at the growth opportunity of the situation. Yeah, right? Like what opportunity? This person is giving me a gift. Like someone telling me that something I did was harmful helps me learn how to not do it again. That is a gift and a very difficult one. So really thinking about what did it take for this person to come to me and say this? What am I showing them in my reaction to that comment or that request? Am I showing them that I value what they've offered me? Or am I showing them that I'm unwilling to listen or change? And often it's so interesting to me, I'll talk to folks and they'll say, well, I had this reaction because I didn't want to be seen as racist. But in the reaction, they actually proved the opposite by not listening and being willing to own that feedback. And so sometimes when we respond with this defensive response, we're actually reinforcing our worst fear rather than sitting back and saying like, this is really hard and I'm going to just breathe through it and figure out what can my response be that values this feedback someone has trusted me enough to give. Because think about when you've had to give hard feedback, it's not easy to do and it feels very risky. So the person giving you that feedback is risking something and also trusting you with their perspective on that and often probably assuming you're not going to deal with it well. Hoping that you'll prove that you can handle it. And so really figuring out how we can be very grateful for that kind of opportunity to grow. Let me just see if there's other ones that I want to lift up some skills. So someone talks about just having to do a lot of research and discussing and learning a lot about an issue and found new people and new ways to learn, new resources and interest and pathways for learning just by exploring something that maybe you were resistant to initially. Yes, thank you so much for pointing this out. So someone talks about, and this is a more complicated conversation than we have time for today. Certainly if we did a whole thing on resiliency and white fragility, I could talk more about this piece. But someone in the chat points out that in discussing resilience, it's important to note that the resilience often depends on systemic supports, like supportive relationships and institutions. I appreciate that you asked about asking for and receiving support and want to emphasize that it's different from resiliency as a personal quality. using community support versus like pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps mentality. 100%, yes. And there's so much around our own resiliency in engaging in these conversations that has to do with our own sense of self-worth, which is heavily tied to a lot of things that are very complicated. Trauma in our history, our own sense of self. For white women in particular, this is very complicated by sexism and our own sense of value as people. And so when we experience complicated emotions around doing something wrong, and this tendency to say, I am a failure and there's something wrong with me, is rooted a lot in our socialization as women. So we have to kind of tease out a little bit the trauma that we've experienced in being socialized in a very sexist and patriarchal society that makes it very difficult sometimes for us to have a sense of self-worth enough to receive feedback that's very difficult without sort of falling apart and feeling like I'm a terrible person and horrible. There's so much there that I think really is about sort of trauma-informed healing and resiliency in terms of that context, but also understanding the importance and value of like therapy resources and mental health support and family relationships and all those things that you bring up in the chat. So I really appreciate you pointing that out. Thank you so much. Someone was talking about physical challenges, just like small progressive steps, not wanting change right now. Like if you want to run 10 miles, you can't run 10 miles tomorrow. You have to like add up to that. You have to build. And so often we want to jump into like, I want to make systemic change tomorrow. And I'm like ready to pull a group together without really having any sense of what's happening around us and what we're capable of accomplishing right now and sort of what we need to learn before we get there. So pausing and just kind of taking a step back and just figuring some things out. Self-reflecting. Someone talks about that. Apologizing, working through problems, listening to my body instead of reacting to it, be more patient. To repair and resolution may not be immediate. Yeah. Yes, like not assuming that something's going to be forgiven right away. And someone asks in the Q&A, what about our own sense of humility as a positive characteristic? Yeah, just being humble and knowing we don't know everything. You know, we're not perfect. We make mistakes, and just how to have humility around things that you're not aware of and don't know, instead of the hubris to assume we get everything right and know everything. I just want to move forward since we're close to the end, but focus on this. Resiliency requires vulnerability, facing uncertainty and exposure and emotional risk, knowing you're enough and maintaining your own sense of wholeness, seeking community and connection. So that speaks a little bit to that idea of like, what resources do we have, and how is that complicated by history and our own lives and what might be going on for us in other areas of our life. And so how do we figure out how to build some of those structures for ourselves, even if it's in seeking community, if we're not able to access some of the more structural supports like mental health support or something like that, which is a whole nother conversation and complexity there. There's a question about, is a repair process you recommend or would point people to? Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. It's from Carrie, one of our chat monitors. Yes, let me think about that. If there's a repair process that we would recommend, or that I would recommend. I do think that it's a lot about apologizing and owning your behavior and then repairing it through showing up differently. I think a lot of the reparation and continued trust is in demonstrating through your behavior that you actually heard what someone said and that you changed your behavior. But I think there's also an element of relationship building there in terms of that repair process. So I will look for some resources I can share with you all about what that might look like. And on the vulnerability piece is just thinking about how you talk about, I accept responsibility. This is important to me. I don't know something. I have to acknowledge I need support around some issue. Asking someone, can I get your take on this? And that would be, you know, like another white person and just saying like, hey, I know you really care about these issues. I did something and I think it wasn't okay. And I just want to kind of talk to you about it. So being willing to reach out. We're so isolated in our whiteness that many of us don't have or don't know that we have people in our lives that we think are willing to talk to us about this. And so how do you find that person? My partner's cousin lives in Kansas, and she lives in a very, very conservative community. And probably 10 years ago, she started like noticing the work that I do, and that, I mean, you can't be around me without talking about anti-oppression. So like, it's really obvious to everyone in my life. So there's no way she could have missed it. And she, you know, really slowly started texting me or Facebook messaging me and just asking questions. Like, you know, when Colin Kaepernick kneeled for the anthem, she wrote me and just was like, hey, can we talk about this? I feel like I don't really understand the first round of Black Lives Matter. She wrote me and was like, hey, I really want to learn more. And so she just started reaching out slowly and saying, like, I don't really have anyone in my community who I think is willing to talk to me about this, and I really want to learn. And so fast forward 10 years, she's now like advocating for policy changes in her work and is starting to push for conversations in her more conservative community. And so I think some of it is just figuring out, like, even if we don't have that close community, is there someone out there that we can reach out to and start to try to figure out how to process through some of this stuff? What can I do better next time? And I made a mistake, but I learned a lot. Just looking towards that vulnerability. How do we own that we don't know everything and we made a mistake, and be vulnerable and admit that we know that that we did something that hurt someone else. So I think the last part is just really thinking about, what does resiliency and racial justice look like? How can you increase your resiliency in order to show up with more accountability for racial justice? And for some of us, it might be, you know, I really need therapy because I've got to figure out how to be okay with myself and how to figure out how to do this. I think it's sometimes tough to find a therapist who can do this. I will say that, but it's not impossible. And there are people who are starting to focus on specifically how to support and coach white folks in particular around this issue. And there's also therapists who support healing and trauma for folks of color who are dealing with racial justice work. And then what would developing more collective resiliency look like as people who value racial justice? So like thinking about as a community of white people, how can we be more resilient instead of so reactive to things where we're called on our racism? And so what are the ways that collective resilience can look as a community? And what does that actually mean and look like? So these are some questions that I would really encourage you just to kind of sit with, because we're certainly not going to answer them in the next 3 minutes that we have. And trying to figure out, you know, how to do some reading on resilience and restorative conversations. And, you know, restorative justice is one avenue. It's a little complicated. That doesn't have its own challenges, but is one avenue towards thinking about how to be resilient and do some of those repair conversations. Let me just see if there's other things in the chat. So someone said, I just want to share a quotation by Samuel Beckett that I've needed to combat my own perfectionism and the damage it's done to me. Ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Yes. Someone mentioned talking with kids. And so we'll share a link with you about having conversations with children about this. And then lots of books in terms of what would be most helpful is which ones you find particularly helpful and why, for sure. Like Dr. Kendi has the book on how to be an anti-racist, and Michelle Alexander on mass incarceration. I will try to figure out if there's a way that we can share with you the more specifically what about those books is helpful, and kind of direct where you might focus your time and energy. Oh, great. Yeah, Johanna says that that she can do a book talk and just kind of help folks get a sense of that as well. Okay, so the last thing I want to do is this piece on just making commitments. So before next week, I would really love if you could, and maybe you do this already, which is amazing, you can do it again. But what are 2 other white people you can connect with this week to talk about whiteness, white fragility, resiliency, and accountability? What's one way you can join with a group, team, or organization to increase your collective resiliency, challenge a system or institution, demonstrate increased accountability to communities of color. This second half might be more complicated for you depending on where you sit, right? So you might be someone who's like, I've been doing this for a while, now I want to kind of amp up and find an additional what I can do next. You might be someone who's like, I'm really new and I just want to try to reach out to someone. So that's fine, just finding where you can kind of focus your time and energy, but really thinking about how can you talk to someone else just between now and next week, someone maybe you've never had this conversation before, or that you just started but haven't really dug in. Find that person and try to talk to them by next week if you can. Okay, so I'm gonna go into the closing part. We do have one more comment in the chat that I'll lift up, and it's just, I think it's important to practice self-compassion and recognize your spheres of influence. For me, it's important to put your power into spaces where you can make a difference instead of getting too lost in areas where you might not see immediate change. Absolutely. So that's what I talked about too last week, is just making sure like we're all in different spaces. You know, some of us are in schools, and some of us are in higher education, and some of us are in community work, and some of us are, you know, in dentist's office and all in business and churches. And so your sphere of influence is where you want to focus your time and energy. Taking it all on it's not gonna help you, certainly, and it's just not sustainable. So thinking about where can you have the most impact. So it's 4 o'clock. I wanna make sure that we end so that you can continue with your day. And I just wanted to highlight this quote from Brene Brown on vulnerability. So it's not winning or losing, it's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. And vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. So really being okay with not being right all the time and making mistakes and fixing them and learning how to move forward, and really welcoming the feedback that we receive around how we show up and trying to do better every day. I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you so much for coming back. We look forward to seeing you next week. And please know that we'll send you the resources and make those accessible to you as soon as we can. So I will see you all next week, hopefully, and really appreciate all your time and energy. Thank you so much.